Power corrupts. That's the title. That's the topic of today's Daily Dose. Look, we've seen throughout history how power corrupts and how people who gain power, they just seem to want more and more power, and then they typically use that power not for good, but for corrupt and even self-serving purposes. I believe we're seeing this on display right now in our lifetime, right here, right now, in our nation even. People in power they're using their own power for their own gain. They're corruptly selling their influence in order to gain financially for their families, to benefit their families, to benefit themselves, to stay out of jail, to silence the opposition, or to prevent themselves from being held accountable. Power. Power is corrupting people right now. And then corrupted people, they do corrupt things with the power. Look, I'm sure you're familiar with this popular statement that says absolute power corrupts absolutely. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, we find this in the life of one of the kings in the Bible. You're familiar with him. His name is Solomon, Mr. Wise Man, right? So much wisdom, but unfortunately, he began to get things twisted and messed up. And it really was a result of power and not being able to handle this power. We discover this situation in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 11, beginning at verse 1, going through about 13. Solomon's about 60 years old by this time. And at first, Solomon's having a great life, doing wise things, raising or leading the nation in a wonderful way. But then he starts to allow his power and his position and what's available to him because of his power get in the way. And he begins to commit sins of immorality and sensuality. But then ultimately, the sins began to grow and became all-out idolatry that would divide his own heart and his nation. See, Solomon could do and have anything he wanted. He had the power. He had the power. And this power allowed him to feed his fleshly desires, which so corrupted him that it produced, even if just for a little while, it produced a state of mental darkness. Power corrupted this once wise man so much that he took so many wives and concubines and strained the finances of his court and his kingdom. He allowed foreigners, those unfriendly to his nation and to his God, into his places of influence. And this led to suspicion among all the Israelites and began to cause division and concern like no other. But then the corruption went to a whole nother level as Solomon took the women from the nations that God had specifically said no. He specifically warned him to avoid. God specifically told the Israelites not to marry Ammonites or Moabites, Edomites, not to marry Sidonites and Hittites. But Solomon ignored that. And in his power, he decided to choose his wives and concubines from these very nations. Look, Solomon had come to the place where he believed that he was above the law. He could make his own rules. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Did God's blessing and anointing on Solomon compensate for this divided and corrupted heart that grew within him? No, it didn't. It didn't. Solomon left a son who was more foolish even than he was, and Solomon even died knowing that he blew it, that the great kingdom that God had given him and given his father David that he was supposed to steward, that kingdom would soon be torn apart. Look, power corrupts individuals. It can corrupt a nation. It can tear apart an individual. It can tear apart a nation. And I believe it's happening. Come on, it's happening right before our eyes on our watch in our nation as it's hemorrhaging under increased corruption, cover-up, abuse, backroom deals, business with national adversaries, lying and cover-up, sexual deviancy in and around the highest levels of power in our nation. Nothing is new. Here it is again. It's happening now on our watch. So now what? What do we do? How do we process this? Well, I want to simply leave us with this directive from Ephesians chapter 5, verse 11, that says, have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. have nothing to do with all this corruption, but rather expose it. If something is corrupt, if something is wrong, if it's twisted, if it's a lie, if it's evil, we, God's people, should not hide our heads in the sand or in the four walls of the church. Rather, we should call out that evil. It's like the famous quote said by Edmund Burke that says that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Let that not be us. Let us not remain silent. But because we love God and we love people, let us speak up. God bless you.